Thank you for joining us for the International Research Center on Cannabis and Mental Health's presentation on hemp and poppies. My name is Jahan Marcu, and I'll be presenting this interesting topic to you. To begin, we're going to tell you a little bit about what our institute does, what we're focused on, and then we'll transition into a discussion about hemp, CBD, and opioid prescription drugs. So the IRCCMH engages in research, education, and advocacy. We are looking at community-based research to bridge a gap between what we find in the lab and community practice among clinicians. We have a big focus on education, especially targeting mental health clinicians and other providers. And again, this focuses on mental health issues and well-being around using medical cannabis and its products. We also advocate for safe and standardized cannabis products as an important public health issue. There's a lot of issues right now in cannabis and cannabinoid research. A lot of issues focus on physical illness, physical measurements of cannabis and cannabinoids on human physiology. A lot of mental health research, majority of it is done in the lab with animal models. What's interesting though, despite nothing being FDA approved for cannabis and mental health, we see a lot of patients report using cannabis for the treatment of symptoms related to mental health disorders. A lot of mental health clinicians view cannabis use as a pathology, but research is currently either in industry or universities somewhat disconnected from the community that practices mental health and well-being treatments. We have ivory tower, political and for-profit motivation. And we think there needs to be more community-based research. What are clinicians encountering? What are their issues? They are having patients using cannabis coming in and getting treatment. So mental health research is a little bit different than some other cannabis type research or other clinical research. And these two quotes kind of help me think about it conceptually. One is Mark Twain, I've suffered a great many misfortunes, most of which never happened. Another great one is suffering happens between the ears. Everything else is just a situation. So there's a lot of popular topics being studied about cannabis and mental health, PTSD, opioid and opiate abuse, the topic of our presentation today, autism. We also have a lot of other interests such as traumatic brain injuries, anorexia, sexuality and well-being, and anxiety, depression, menopause, other gains from cannabis treatments, and surveying and understanding mental health clinician knowledge and attitudes towards cannabis. My colleague Jahan Marcu and I have started to look at the knowledge gap for mental health clinicians. There is, as you might imagine, a lack of agreement on differences between healthy use and problematic use of cannabis. A lot of cannabis recommendations are for physical conditions instead of mental health. We find that in our survey of mental health clinicians that most are uneducated about the endocannabinoid system, especially in regards to its impact on mood, its role that it plays in mood. Also, a lot of clinicians still feel unsure about cannabis's effect on future drug use as a gateway risk or risk for schizophrenia, despite the gateway theory being largely debunked. And I think almost all health professionals would agree that the reason people use one drug and go on to use other drugs are for reasons other than the first time they used cannabis. A lot of mental health clinicians know little about dosing, biphasic effect, dosing strategies such as microdosing, the composition of different products, or the impact of different methods of administration forms or consumption. In the past, policy has helped to dictate a lot of research. Ethical obligations to provide safe treatment options for patients have been sort of questionable. In the United States, we see dispensary agent or bud tenders, as they're called sometimes, in this position where they're sometimes making recommendations for patients. In some states, this isn't allowed. In some states, it's a little more loosey-goosey. But overall, patients should be able to access standardized and safe products. A lot of issues arise when you don't know what you're getting. You don't know if the label is accurate. You might overdose or underdose on the amount you're trying to reach to treat symptoms. Safety is always a public health concern around any product that alters mood or cognition. In terms of drug treatment and those programs, absent fails, and harm reduction, we believe is the key. We believe that science moving forward with cannabis should help decide policy. So a little bit about my background and presenting to you here today. I received my Ph.D. for studying the pharmacology and function of cannabinoid receptors. I've been involved with a lot of interesting projects, including helping develop standards for medical cannabis products in the US. I've worked with the American Chemical Society to help found their cannabis chemistry subdivision. My colleague Jahan Marcu and I have founded this institute last year with grant and private funding. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Medical Cannabis, and Jen and I co-host a show called New Hemp Times with the comedian actor Greer Barnes. So today I'm going to talk about a couple things. The key points I really think you should go, a little bit of a spoiler alert for the presentation, is that the endocannabinoid system is relatively newly discovered. It was really discovered in the 1990s. One of the most abundant proteins in the mammalian brain are the receptors for things like THC. This system regulates a lot of things, but notably to help us to eat, sleep, relax, forget, and protect our body from harm. CBD medications and formulations really need to be researched to develop something that can effectively treat opioid use and other related substance use disorders. And there's some research here to support this that we'll discuss. What's also been surfacing is that CBD does have limits to it. It has side effects and potential drug-drug interactions that are just starting to be looked at and understood. But animal and preliminary human studies overall support CBD for the treatment of substance use disorders. So today we're going to go through a little bit overview of the endocannabinoid system, overview of opioids and opiates, discuss differences between CBD and THC. We'll take a look at the opioid epidemic, interactions between CBD and opioids, and discuss some of the side effects and drug-drug interactions that have been reported. We'll end with a recap about the current legal status, as a lot of these regulatory changes to cannabis are a moving target and it's a little hard to keep up with. So what is the endocannabinoid system? Well, it's an adaptive response to stress. It is aimed at reestablishing homeostasis in the body. If you're overstimulated or understimulated, it tries to bring you back to that baseline. The active constituents of the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoids, these are synthesized on demand, and this is unique. I bet there's only one or two other substances in the human body that are stored, that are synthesized. Most are stored and then released. These are synthesized as needed. Then this covers, again, physiological process involved with helping us eat, sleep, relax, forget, and protect. And forgetting is an important thing. If I remembered every face I saw, on the subway from Brooklyn to Manhattan, my head would explode. You need a system to help you get rid of information that's no longer useful or potentially damaging to you. And this is why some researchers think that cannabis could be helpful to treat things like PTSD. Excuse me. The endocannabinoid system is made up of two main receptors: the type 1 receptor, CB1, primarily found in the brain and on neurons, and the type 2 receptor, which is largely an immune receptor helping to control inflammation. Stimulating the CB1 receptor with THC, that leads to a lot of effects, including analgesia or pain relief, as well as intoxication. CB2 stimulation does not. Again, but it still plays a role in pain and inflammation. There are a lot of flavors of cannabinoids. There's three main flavors. The endocannabinoids, those are made by all mammals, such as anandamide and 2-AG. There are phytocannabinoids, which are made by plants, and we find a lot of these in plants. Now, THC and CBD are only found on the cannabis or hemp plant, but other plants make cannabinoids, particularly beta-caryophyllene, which is a terpene and cannabinoid and is very, very potent at CB2 receptors. We have synthetic cannabinoids, and these are largely, made in a lab. They're synthetic, right? We have FDA-approved Marinol. We have synthetic cannabinoids like JWH18. Some of the pictures you see here are all licensed pharmaceutical preparations of cannabis, most of which are not presently allowed in the US. So, cannabis floss produced by Bedrocan is only available in Europe, as is Sativex, is I think licensed in over 30 countries except the US. But there are, again, a lot of different preparations and approved medicines. What's interesting here is that while medical cannabis, as we know it, is a Schedule I substance, THC is Schedule I when found on the marijuana plant. It actually appears in 3 different scheduling categories. If you thought CBD was confusing, THC actually appears in Schedule I, II, and III. Schedule I in the form of whole plant cannabis, Schedule II in the form of a liquid preparation by Syndros, shown there with the syringe plunger, and as a Schedule III drug in the form of Marinol. Kind of looks like, the caviar of prescription medications. Where do cannabinoids come from? Well, they largely are produced most abundantly in the flowering parts of the plants. You can find small amounts, in the 0.05 or 0.02% range in stems and fan leaves. The roots do not produce any cannabinoids. Fertilized or unfertilized flowers, that is with or without seeds, can produce between 13 and there's reports of upwards of 30% THC or cannabinoid content. Targeted extraction for the trichomes can result in upwards of 60% cannabinoid oil content, and seeds and sprouts produce no cannabinoids, but have other health and nutritional factors. So there have been some famous hemp or cannabis products, such as the first pairs of Levi's jeans, currency, such as the US dollar, the Dutch East India Company, which played a role in creating a lot of opioid addiction or opiate addiction. Their sails were made of hemp because they wouldn't deteriorate at sea, far superior to cotton. And today the electric BMW has a lot of pieces made from hemp. Everything that looks like wood, the paneling, is pressed hemp. Now, to transition a little bit, cannabis and the poppy plant share a similar history in some regards. Both are plant-derived products used for thousands of years and were used for a really long time until we discovered the receptor system for them. It really wasn't until the 70s that endorphins and the different types of opioid receptors were established and discovered. We've heard of endorphins like the runner's high. That literally stands for endogenous morphine. So your body produces its own opiates. But preparations directly from the plant extracts of the poppies are opiates. Synthetic drugs fall under opioids, but opiates are also opioids. So not all opiates are opioids. And it's important to think about that. So when you hear the word term opiates, it's largely referring to things like heroin or opium. Opioids include opiates, but also include synthetic drugs. When the Dutch East India Company started trading opium, it was about, around the 17th or 18th century and 1700s, is about, 200 chests or so, each containing about, 50 kilos or so of opium were being traded. But by the 1880s, trade with China through a single port, they were transporting over 4 million kilos of opium, and it's estimated that created about 12 million addicts around that time. And today, we don't see we still see morphine used in things like surgery and things like that, but we have other preparations, codeine, fentanyl, and tramadol. Now, there have been some famous opiate drugs on the market in the US. I've included 4 of the most dangerous drugs ever marketed here. One is not an opiate because we can't just pick on opiates. There's been other drugs that have been quite dangerous, but I thought these would be some good examples. One is Bayer's heroin, which was the cheapest, is basically medication for the relief of coughs as marketed. We also had Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained about 65 milligrams of morphine per ounce or spoonful or so, and was really marketed towards helping to treat teething in children. An op-ed in the New York Times around the turn of the last century said, quote, "Like magic, he soon went to sleep and all pain and nervousness disappeared." Laudanum, which is a ethanolic tincture of with basically morphine in it, was also marketed towards children as well. And quote, this was part of the marketing, "It's no stupefactive, deadly narcotic, but rather a veritable preservative of infants." And you know, just to kind of compare it, Quaaludes were marketed in a similar way up until about 1982 as a great way to start your morning was to start with a Quaalude at night. And you can see this ad from a magazine, I believe it was in the 70s. But today we have a lot of opioid prescription drugs and compounds, everything from extended release morphine to OxyContin to other preparations of oxymorphone. But what I'd like to talk a little bit is about fentanyl, because we're going to discuss a study which involves combining CBD with fentanyl in the clinic. So fentanyl is about 80 to 100 times more potent than morphine. You can see on the right here, I have these 2 little jars, one with heroin, one with fentanyl, looking at their LD50, which is basically what a lethal dose looks like. And below that is a theoretical lethal dose of cannabis, especially if dropped on you from a significant height. So fentanyl has a rapid onset, short duration of effect. It's used in end-stage terminal illnesses like cancer, but it has a lot of diversion industry drug formulations, and it's appearing in fentanyl-laced cocaine and heroin is an issue. And you see names like Dance Fever, Goodfella, Tango and Cash. And it is a big issue right now. So cannabis is a little bit different. A toxic lethal overdose is not possible. The receptors don't exist in really insignificant amounts in the brainstem where breathing is controlled. So just briefly, THC stimulates CB1 and CB2 receptors. That's how it exerts its positive and negative effects. CBD has different main targets, such as ion channels important for pain, as well as serotonin receptors and adenosine receptors, and other non-receptor related mechanisms can help to elevate levels of endocannabinoids by preventing their degradation. We have a couple main types of cannabis, our chemical varieties, chemovars, THC predominant, THC CBD mix, CBD predominant. There's also terpene dominant strains that have very little or no cannabinoids on them as well. And again, another fun fact to keep in mind is that these receptors are the most important proteins in the human brain, CB1, which makes them a great therapeutic target. So just to kind of quickly go through some fun facts about THC, it's been well studied for its pain relieving effects. It has a very potent anti-inflammatory effect. It's not a COX-1 or COX-2 inhibitor. It's been shown to decrease beta amyloid plaque formation. CBD was isolated in the 1940s, but the structure was correctly identified in 1963 by Meshulam. It really doesn't stimulate CB1 receptors. It actually shows the ability to kind of block it, which may be part of its role in mitigating the intoxicating properties of THC. It's a very strong neuroprotective like THC. These are wonderful antioxidants. It is an alerting compound. It stimulates adenosine receptors, which are the same targets of drugs like caffeine. So CBD can be alerting versus THC, which is sedating in the clinic. strong anticonvulsant and antioxidant, anti-anxiety properties have been reported, and some anti-cancer properties in a lot of cell lines. One of the most interesting things here, I think, is that it displays activity that's stimulating serotonin receptors, the 5-HT1A receptors, which may be really important for leveraging its ability as an anti-anxiety compound. It's shown some other interesting things, ability to affect prion accumulation in models of mad cow disease that can also help to stimulate bone fracture healing. So, cannabis research has shown some promise. There's been some interesting things looked at, like the drug abuse liability when you co-administer an opioid with something like THC or CBD. Now, the research is a little mixed on this. It shows that, well, it doesn't increase the liability or the drug abuse liability of using cannabis or of cannabis products, but there are some inconsistencies with whether or not it reduces opioid drug use every time. There are nuances to this discussion about when cannabis is effective, whether it's a state program reducing opioid prescriptions and overdoses. There are issues with people being able to access it. For example, early adopters who had both adult use and medical cannabis programs saw perhaps the biggest benefits versus other states. So just because you have a law or one dispensary open in your state doesn't mean you're going to suddenly magically see these benefits. And also, there are changes that can happen to these programs which can affect their functionality. So there are confounding variables. Other drugs people are using, prescription and illicit. Some of these studies do not take into account product composition. So is it THC rich? Is it CBD rich? How potent is it? How much are they using? And there's also potential drug-drug interactions that could be explaining some of these effects. So when we talk about just at a basic level, what mechanisms happen, when you're zooming in through the microscope onto cells? Well, animals which don't have cannabinoid receptors have reduced opiate rewards. That is, they have trouble basically becoming addicted or displaying that behavior in a laboratory setting. Opioids regulate the release of endocannabinoids, their synthesis, and endocannabinoids alter opioid peptide levels. So they kind of help to stimulate each other. The endocannabinoid system and the endorphin system often work in concert or together. Their receptors are expressed in the same cells in very particular neuronal pathways, many of which are implicated in use disorders and addiction. Opioid and cannabinoid receptors also share similar intrasignaling cascades. And so the key point here is that there is a convergence of opioid cannabinoid interactions, which opens up opportunities to assess potential cannabinoid interventions for OUD, for opioid use disorder. So let's make a case for CBD for opioid use disorder, and we'll start with just some simple fun things about receptors and cells. What's really interesting is that we talk about CBD being an allosteric modulator, modulating CB1 receptor. It also has this effect at the mu and sigma opioid receptors, which is helped make things that it changed the interaction or the effect or the kinetics or something is happening there when CBD is in the system and there are opioids present at the receptors. In animals, CBD as early as 1975 was shown to reduce the rewarding properties and withdrawal effects of opioids in mice. More recently, it's been shown to attenuate cue-induced heroin-seeking behavior. You get an animal dependent on heroin. They will push a bell, ring a buzzer, go in part of the cage to demand or request heroin. And you can trigger this by conditioning them to kind of like Pavlov's dog. Every time they hear a bell or see a light, it means an injection. And this is actually related to something called CFOS positive neurons. And across mammals, kind of the more higher levels you have of CFOS, they are correlated or associated with a high potential for substance use. In animals that are abusing inhalants or other drugs, you see this increase in CFOS. It's thought that if you can decrease the number of CFOS positive neurons in places like the amygdala, which help control things like anxiety and fear, that you will help diminish the rewarding properties of other drugs of abuse. In humans, CBD is shown to modulate anxiety, which anxiety is very triggering for addiction and relapse. CBD can help reduce amygdala activation, so that fear and anxiety response. And in a pilot study by Dr. Yasmin Hurd, they found that CBD reduced similar heroin-related cue-induced cravings. So in a very particular part of the addiction and relapse cycle, CBD was shown to be effective, similar to what we've seen in animals. So basically what we're saying here is these properties that reducing the rewarding effects of drugs of abuse, reducing anxiety, these could translate into potentially modulating the addiction-related outcomes. These are good things to think about if you're trying to treat a substance use disorder. Fresh out of the gates, this paper for 2019 came out. Very interesting research. Basically, it's one of the first studies, I think, that has looked at vaporized, inhaled amounts of CBD and THC in different combinations. You think this type of research had been done to death, but it actually is, we're just really scratching the surface on this particular delivery form and combinations. And what was the major finding was that low doses of CBD, when combined with THC, enhanced some of the intoxicating properties, while higher doses of CBD reduced the intoxicating effects of THC. So their high dose of CBD was 400 milligrams or 4 milligrams. So they're not entirely sure why, but again, high amounts of CBD when vaporized showed some intoxicating properties. This could simply be related to the anti-anxiety properties that make people more relaxed. But again, it's a very interesting study that looks at how inhalation and combinations can change some of these subjective measures. Really, really interesting study on fentanyl and CBD administered in humans. So this is really kind of the proof, the first sort of safety test that, well, if cannabinoids, things from the cannabis plant, preparations of cannabis products, are useful for treating opioid use disorder or could potentially be a replacement, how do they interact with one of the most potent and dangerous opioids we know? So if we hypothesize that CBD is a potential treatment for opioid addiction, then a safety study is an important first step. So let's, this is the researchers thinking, let's give CBD to people who are taking a high potency opioid. And what they found was really important is CBD does not exacerbate adverse events associated with intravenous fentanyl administration, that is, injections of fentanyl. So when you administer CBD with fentanyl in a clinical setting, was safe and well tolerated. And again, this provides data for this foundational work for moving this research ahead. We're really kind of at the tip of the iceberg here in moving this research along and getting really targeted in what products work, which ones don't, when to use them, when not to use them, what administration form. So questions remain about CBD for opioid use disorder. What phase of the abuse cycle for different classes of addictive substances, that remains largely understudied. But in terms of public health and policy, we know that unlike most opioid medications, CBD products have a low value on the illicit market. There isn't a lot of diversion of CBD products from medical cannabis operations, much like there is very little diversion of Marinol, Sativex, or the cigarettes produced by the University of Mississippi. There's limited misuse and diversion potential of cannabinoid medications. They also have a phenomenally low toxicity. However, there have been some here and there reports expressing concern for things that should make us stop and think a little bit. So in animal studies of animals given superhuman doses of CBD, they see some changes in cell viability. They see less capacity for fertilization and the inhibition of certain proteins in the liver involved with metabolizing drugs, and that could potentially have a side effect. In humans, there's been some concern. Now, there's been 4 studies published on the topic of CBD and intraocular pressure. There could be some secret research published by, GW Pharma that we haven't seen, or other company, but what's available is what we'll discuss. And 3 out of the 4 studies did not find an increase in intraocular pressure. That is, pressure in the eye, very important for glaucoma patients taking cannabis products to decrease that pressure. But the 4th study, unlike the others, actually looked at CBD administration into the eye, found that it could increase intraocular pressure. It can block the effects of THC as well, if you're trying to reduce intraocular pressure. So I guess the takeaway is avoid putting CBD directly into your eyes for the time being until this research is sussed out a little bit more. There also are concerns of effect on hormone levels from long-term use, and this could be both related to therapeutic or potentially negative effects, determining on the amount and how you're administering. And I think one of the things that will become more and more important to address in terms of administration routes and conditions is, what about drug-drug interactions, about CBD affecting other medications? You can see lots of statistics, people 45, 50 and over are on an average of 6 or more prescription medications. And now you're throwing something else in there. And a lot of people have looked at inhalation as a way to bypass the liver and some of those complications. So when we talk about drug-drug interactions, we are largely talking about interactions from oral medications that are going through the liver, but they can occur with converging effects and things like that as well. So drug-drug interactions, or DDIs, basically are potential concern if you're taking more than one medicine at a time. And these adverse events due to multiple drugs is on the rise. And there's a large family, the cytochrome P450, CYP450. That's really something you should remember when it comes to cannabinoid metabolism. And there are many different types, and we inherit 2 copies from our parents of these drugs, and depending on if we get a fast one or a slow metabolizing protein, can change our experience with drugs. So there are a fair number of drugs that drugs and CBD target the same CYP enzyme. So CYP3A4 is an enzyme in the liver. And clarithromycin, ketoconazole, and related drugs also go inhibit this enzyme. So you imagine if you're taking one of those 4 drugs or drugs from those classes, this is going to lead to slower CBD degradation and could lead to higher CBD doses that are longer, pharmaceutically active. So if you're not clearing it out of your system, it's staying there longer. So it might make you more sensitive. In contrast, CBD can reduce the bioavailability of certain prescription drugs as well by getting in the receptor or the liver enzyme. And what's kind of a little a moment to stop and think is that about 60% of clinically prescribed drugs are metabolized via CYP3A4, also a common target of CBD when it's being metabolized in the body. So, CBD is deemed a Schedule I drug right now by both the FDA and DEA, pursuant to the 1970 CSA. There are exceptions to this. There are exemptions. Epidiolex is a Schedule V, but that's different. That's for a very specific preparation, just like Marinol in Schedule III. I'm chemotype agnostic is my bias. I believe it's 1. Because you have cannabis sativa plant, and then you have it cultivated different ways to meet different regulatory requirements and labeling requirements. But regardless of whether or not you're chemotype agnostic, a license is generally still required, some sort of exemption. So there are different regulations for what you might label hemp or cannabis, but again, both require registration and following regulations. To quote some experts on the subject, technically speaking, and despite not being explicitly mentioned in the CSA, hemp is a controlled substance unless an exemption applies in the United States. The World Health Organization has helped to either clarify or confuse this matter a little bit, but we'll see how that is interpreted. But basically right now, domestically cultivated hemp is only lawful when cultivated under a pilot program or some sort of exemption. Some of you may have heard over the weekend, over the last week, that one of the largest drug busts, or they thought in the Midwest is one of the largest drug busts, was a big shipment of hemp being transported by truck, and we believe those people are still in custody while this is being sorted out. But the Farm Bill may clarify much of the current confusion surrounding CBD's legal status. But regardless of where you fall in the chemotype spectrum or CBD spectrum, label claims and accuracy are significant issues that can invite FDA interference, cease and desist things. So be very careful. It's a moving target. It's a little hard to keep up with, but there are both high risk and low risk practices going on with CBD, but it generally remains unenforced as a Schedule I drug. Adding to this confusion, it is not scheduled in many other countries, especially in Europe. So just to sum up things before we start taking questions, clinical trials, I think, are one of the highest priorities right now to establish appropriate formulations, entourage effects with other cannabinoids and terpenes, what routes of administration, inhaled, oral, under the tongue, in the ear, transdermal cream. And we have to start to think about treatment with CBD for opioid use disorder and what is the most efficient or effective way to use that where most people get the benefit. Because like I said, some of the research shows both either increases and decreases in opioid prescription use and mortality, depending on a lot of nuanced factors related to, is there effective access in the state, what types of products are available, and whether or not those products are accurately labeled and standardized. What's good news is that CBD's status in regards to the law appears to be expanding, but it's difficult to predict exactly what will happen. It'd be great if it could officially fall out of international control and not be a scheduled drug. But again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I hear that there's still, it's hard to predict what will happen. But again, it appears that this is expanding. So here's some fun references that we use to generate this presentation. We have a lot of upcoming events. We're going to be speaking at NYU on the 21st. So if you go to irccmh.org/events, you can check out all of our speaking engagements and things we're doing around. Our next webinar will be, we're planning it for March 4th, and it'll be on Alex Berenson's horrific manifesto called Tell Your Children. And we're calling this webinar, Tell Your Children to Think Critically About What They Read. For those of you who sign up for the webinar, we'll be sending around an email requesting your preferred time. You want it in the morning, afternoon, does this evening slot work? But thank you all for your attention. I just want to say that if you want to find out more information about getting involved with research, about having clinical trials conducted, studying products, please write our CEO, Jay Roberts, at irccmh.org. And with that, I will see if we have any questions.
Jahan, it looks like we have a couple of questions related to whether or not we will make this available to view again, and if the slides would be available.
Yeah, so we plan on posting a version of this webinar where, online, and the slides will be available for attendees as a PDF. So are there any other questions for the moment? You guys got all your things answered. That's great.
So, this is helpful to you all.
So
yes.
I guess I would just say something to keep in mind is that the people who are scared of cannabis, the Sabés and Berensons of the world, are looking at the data where cannabis has not been effective for things related to opioids. And all research has flaws in it, but I think it's important to really push the industry to help support this area of research. It is really, really, NIDA has put more funds to it, but we really need to look at products on the market, not, you know, products that are theoretical preparations, but that actually people are actually using. Okay. Well, thank you all much for your kind words. I'm glad it's fascinating. Okay. How much research have you done on various CBD? Okay. So we got some questions coming in.
Great.
All right. So someone is asking about CBD THC tinctures, especially with numerous CBD compounds. You know, the poster child of tinctures is Sativex, right? It is just hash oil and ethanol, a little bit of peppermint oil added in there, and it's sprayed under the tongue and absorbed. I guess there are two kind of caveats, I'd say, to tinctures. One is if they're swallowed, it's a form of oral administration. You know, Syndros took this approach. They have a liquid suspension of THC. Again, some people going through chemotherapy and other conditions have difficulty swallowing, so liquid preparations are usually swallowed. Another thing is that you know, using ethanol or other things that can be absorbed under the tongue buccally, it'll go right to the brain and bypass the liver. And that's the whole idea behind Sativex, is it can be applied under the tongue, absorbed through our mucous membranes of our mouth, and effectively head to the brain. What's interesting about this is that if you were, say, to get groups of people, some were inhaling cannabis in a vaporizer or smoking it, and some were applying it under the tongue and letting it absorb, the levels in the blood would be vastly different. So if you were doing a blood test, you would probably very, very little, if any, would show up in your circulating blood if you were taking it under the tongue in a tincture type preparation. Our next, so that was a great question, Alo.
And I like Chris's computers question about if we're working with any pharmacy colleges.
Yes, we are developing some accredited education for mental health clinicians. We've been talking to some different schools. Jan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just a little bit about us, thanks, Jahan, in that we actually partner with as many universities and colleges as we can, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. You know, we can't be experts in everything. As a clinician myself, I'm mostly interested in what happens to the patients, whereas Jahan's perspective is much more chemically focused than mine. But one of the things is that if you know of anyone who's interested in working with us or any ideas you might have, we're looking for partners, just because we find that a multidisciplinary approach is much more powerful than just living in our silos. In addition, we have we work with several universities across the country, actually across the world, and we provide education, but also insight into research design for cannabis and cannabis-associated products. Another thing I am going to ask all of you to do, if you don't mind, is if you have any ideas or anything that you would like to hear a webinar on, we're always open to suggestions from people within the community. So please feel free to put any kind of potential cannabis-related area of interest that you have, and we'll do our best to try to provide that education around that.
Thank you, Jan. And I'd like to say that 2 people actually use the Q&A feature, so I'd like to get to their questions and answer them as best I can. So Sean asked, how effective is consuming the oil internally compared to a water-soluble product? I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but the bioavailability of consuming cannabinoids orally is not great. I'm just going to say it, and I don't mean to be a jerk, but THC is kind of a lousy drug by itself, and this is a great way for us to discuss this, is that, you take it orally, it has low bioavailability, tends to have sort of an unpredictable onset, half hour to a couple hours. That's why a lot of times inhaling it and titrating it through that way or through applying it under the tongue is more effective, because it has more bioavailability, much clearer onset as well. So another question is from Ider Cole, is vaping CBD safe? I think that is a great question, and it also brings up issues or concerns about some studies where people are like, hey, smoking cannabis is linked to this. Well, what type of cannabis, how much, how long? Those are important factors. And so in general, it appears that inhaling vaporized CBD is relatively innocuous. It does not look like it causes impairment to the degree that something like other substances will. So
Jahan, can we also address, Michelle had asked the question on the other screen about lots of claims from companies saying they're highest quality. How is that defined?
that's a good question. You should ask them. So when you're looking at products, so for many years, I worked in doing label claims and regulatory compliance at cannabis operations, worked on standards for this. We published a study in JAMA with Marcel Bond-Miller and Ryan Vandry on CBD label claims and accuracy of the content. And so I think when you're looking at a label, look for seals, certifications, and also, you can use the internet to verify whether or not they're real or not. If someone is GMP compliant, there's a paper trail. If they're somehow accredited or certified, there should be a paper trail, should be able to verify that. Like if you're buying coffee, you can see the little man holding the scales, oh, that's the fair trade symbol. You can go and look up that company and see if they've applied and if it's true.
And I would like to interject here if it's okay. I had a patient come to my office and bring me some CBD oil she had purchased and spent a lot of money on the CBD oil. And when we went to her packaging, as well as the website that promoted the product, including it was the product's manufacturer, we couldn't find any real testing on there. No testing results, no certification or anything. And I think that's probably a real world kind of issue. So for example, if you are, I know around here where we live is that there are a lot of coffee shops that are selling CBD oils in the actual product of coffee, but we don't know where it comes from. So we always, Jahan and I always encourage people to really know their source.
Thank you. I think it's a great point. So be critical, ask questions. If you're talking to a CBD company, they would probably, if they're a good one, they'll love to brag about all the great things they're doing and how safe their products are and the pains they go to make a reliable, safe product that meets regulatory requirements. So again, I would, if you can't look up what's on the label, ask them directly for evidence. We got a question from Rachel, which asks, are there many studies related to the bioavailability of transdermal application of cannabinoids? Great study or great question. The answer is yes and no. Just applying, say, THC, CBD, some little cannabis oil dissolved in ethanol in your skin. Hey, you have cannabinoid receptors in hair follicles and on your skin. Your skin is one of your largest organs of your body. It interacts with the environment, transmits signals. And since a lot of topical applications, but to actually get through the skin, there's a little bit of an issue there because a lot of us have a layer of fat between our skin and the rest of our body where the cannabinoids will get trapped in. Your body, when you consume cannabis, part of the reason it has low bioavailability and is because your body thinks it's fat and sucks it up into fat. And that's another reason why drug tests can be failed 30 days or longer after last consuming cannabis, because it's stored in fat and released slowly over time. But there have been some breakthroughs in this area of research. One of the companies that seems to have got it down is Zynerba. It's a pharmaceutical company. They have a transdermal patch, I believe, or preparation for CBD. But again, I think it comes into what you're putting it into to get it across the barriers. Your skin doesn't like things going through it. It really doesn't, and it has evolved to keep things out. It's the barrier. So you're going to have to trick that barrier and use something to get it across. So just rubbing oil on your skin might be great for some dermatitis or something topical you have there. There's studies on acne, but that's not transdermal. We're trying to get through the skin and things like that. And that requires some formulation and some strategy there with what chemicals or solutions you're going to use to help those cannabinoids get into the body. A great question. Someone, Sean, followed up with asking about if CBD oils are safe to consume. Again, this gets back to their source of origin, what else you're taking with them. And again, I think, largely we're still in a trial and error period with a lot of cannabis-based products or hemp products. But overall, by themselves, they have low toxicity. There isn't a large chance to be intoxicated or impaired from these preparations if they have what they say they have in them. Where it gets complicated is when you put it out in the real world and people are consuming lots of different substances, caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, plus prescription meds, then you throw a glob of oil down your throat. I mean, sometimes it really depends on some environmental factors or genetic factors. And so, again, it's important to track these things. But again, generally, in clinical setting, safe, but in reality, when you're out in the real world, there are some nuances and factors that could affect the safety. And I think when we think about drug-drug interactions, there's two ways to think about it. One is a substance is a perpetrator of the adverse event from a drug-drug interaction. And the other way is to look at it as a victim of a drug-drug interaction. So I think that's an important concept. It's not that one substance is always the bad one. Sometimes they are victims of other drugs that make them unsafe or unpredictable. And we're starting to zero in on this. And so I think in the future, there will be, just like with all medications, your doctor might be getting a medication that, metabolically speaking, it's passing out through your urine. And your doctor might find with your prescription drugs that, oh, you have these two drugs that are both clearing through your urine. They don't play well together. I'm going to give you another formulation that you poo out instead of pee out, or other things like that. So there are strategies that exist for medications, and I think it's time we started educating patients and getting a little clearer grasp on, are there potential risks that we're not thinking about, and how can we prevent them? So thank you. Those are some fun questions. If there are any other late-breaking questions, we'd again encourage you to check out our events page, email us for topics. We're going to be trying to do a webinar a week. We have just launched a YouTube channel. You look for the International Research Center on Cannabis and Mental Health. We have one video up there right now just about Alex Barrison's book, which is pretty fun. And we'll be posting this webinar on that site as well as social media. But if there are no further questions, I will, questions answered about CBD going once, going twice, and sold. I'd like to thank you all for your time and energy in this and your wonderful questions. I look forward to interacting with many of you in the future and hopefully maybe seeing you at some events in the near future. So be safe out there and think critically about what people tell you about cannabis.